Hello everyone, I'm Jiang and welcome to Jiang Decoded. Today, we're looking beyond the headlines to examine a question that has become increasingly difficult to answer with certainty. Is the latest confrontation between the United States and Iran simply another regional crisis, or could it represent the beginning of a broader geopolitical shift? In recent weeks, reports have described renewed military strikes, rising tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, disruptions to commercial shipping, and growing uncertainty across the Middle East. At the same time, political leaders have used different language to describe the situation, with some referring to limited military operations, while others warn that the risks of wider escalation continue to grow. These differences in language matter. The way governments describe a conflict often shapes public expectations, diplomatic options, and international responses. History shows that military operations do not always begin with a formal declaration of war. Sometimes, governments intentionally use more limited language while trying to preserve diplomatic flexibility or avoid committing themselves to a broader conflict. Whether that approach succeeds depends on events unfolding far beyond official statements. To understand today's situation, we first need to examine how rapidly recent developments have unfolded. Following the collapse of earlier diplomatic efforts, military activity reportedly intensified around several strategic locations connected to Iran's southern coastline and nearby shipping routes. Reports also describe incidents involving commercial vessels and military facilities linked to regional partners of the United States. These developments immediately attracted international attention because they occurred near one of the world's most important maritime trade corridors. The Strait of Hormuz is far more than a narrow waterway. A significant share of globally traded oil and other energy exports passes through this route each day. Even limited disruptions can influence shipping costs, insurance premiums, financial markets, and energy prices around the world. For that reason, governments far beyond the Middle East closely monitor developments in the region. Markets often react before political leaders reach diplomatic solutions. A rise in uncertainty alone can affect investment decisions, transportation costs, and business confidence. This illustrates an important principle of international politics. Military actions are rarely judged only by their immediate battlefield results. They are also measured by their economic consequences, diplomatic impact, and influence on global confidence. At the same time, political leadership plays an equally important role. Major foreign policy decisions rarely depend on one individual alone. They involve presidents, legislators, military advisors, diplomats, intelligence agencies, and long-standing alliances. When experienced political figures leave the scene, questions naturally arise about how decision-making may evolve, particularly during periods of heightened international tension. Recent political developments in Washington have therefore attracted almost as much attention as the military events themselves. Observers continue debating how leadership changes, congressional dynamics, and public opinion could influence future American policy toward the region. Yet another important factor often receives less attention. Every government must balance military objectives with political realities at home. Military operations require public support, financial resources, diplomatic coordination, and clearly defined objectives. Without those elements, even successful military actions can become increasingly difficult to sustain over longer periods. This helps explain why policymakers frequently face competing priorities. On one hand, they may wish to demonstrate resolve and protect strategic interests. On the other, they must also consider economic stability, alliance relationships, domestic political debate, and the long-term consequences of continued escalation. That balance has shaped countless international crises throughout modern history. The current situation appears no different. Rather than asking only whether military operations will continue, a more important question is beginning to emerge. Can political leadership maintain a clear and consistent long-term strategy while managing growing regional uncertainty? Because history suggests that prolonged crises are rarely determined by military strength alone. They are often shaped by political decisions, diplomatic choices, economic resilience, and the ability of governments to maintain public confidence over time. As we've seen, military developments are only one part of the story. The broader question is how these events may reshape international relationships, economic stability, and strategic decision-making, not just in Washington, but across the Middle East and beyond. One of the first concerns for America's regional partners is predictability. Allied governments rely on clear communication when making security, diplomatic, and economic decisions. During periods of heightened tension, consistency can be just as valuable as military capability. If policy appears uncertain or rapidly changing, allies may hesitate before making important strategic commitments of their own. At the same time, rival governments may attempt to interpret that uncertainty in ways that strengthen their own negotiating position. This is one reason why diplomatic messaging matters. Foreign policy is not communicated only through speeches. It is also communicated through military deployments, economic sanctions, negotiations, and the consistency of government actions over time. Energy markets provide another example of how geopolitical events quickly affect everyday life. Whenever tensions rise around major shipping routes, investors begin assessing the possibility of supply disruptions. Even if exports continue normally, the perception of increased risk can influence transportation costs, insurance rates, and commodity prices. For households around the world, these effects may eventually appear in the form of higher fuel prices or increased transportation costs. For businesses, they can influence manufacturing expenses, logistics, and long-term investment decisions. This demonstrates an important reality of today's global economy. Regional conflicts rarely remain regional for long, because international trade, financial markets, and energy supplies are deeply interconnected. Events occurring thousands of miles away can eventually affect consumers, businesses, and governments across multiple continents. Another challenge facing policymakers is uncertainty itself. No government has perfect information. Intelligence assessments continue evolving as new evidence becomes available. Diplomatic negotiations take unexpected turns, and military situations change rapidly. That is why responsible strategic planning rarely depends on absolute certainty. Instead, governments prepare for multiple possible outcomes while remaining flexible enough to adapt as conditions evolve. Looking ahead, analysts generally discuss several possible paths. The first is continued limited confrontation. Under this scenario, military operations remain relatively contained. Diplomatic communication continues behind the scenes, and both sides attempt to avoid a broader regional conflict despite ongoing tensions. The second possibility is renewed diplomacy. History has shown that periods of confrontation are sometimes followed by negotiations, particularly when prolonged conflict becomes increasingly costly for all parties involved. While diplomatic progress can be difficult, communication channels often remain active even during periods of heightened military activity. A third possibility involves prolonged strategic competition. Rather than one decisive event, tensions could continue through economic pressure, regional alliances, cyber operations, sanctions, and limited military actions without developing into a full-scale war. International relations have seen similar patterns before. Competition between rival states does not always produce direct military conflict, but it can reshape alliances, influence global markets, and alter diplomatic priorities for years. This is why analysts continue emphasizing the importance of watching not only battlefield developments, but also political decisions made in Washington, Tehran, and other regional capitals. The direction of the crisis will likely depend as much on diplomacy and political judgment as on military capability. Perhaps the most important lesson is this. Geopolitical crises often appear sudden when viewed through daily headlines. In reality, they usually develop over months or even years through a series of interconnected decisions, negotiations, misunderstandings, and strategic calculations. Understanding those underlying patterns allows us to evaluate events more carefully rather than reacting only to the latest headline. At the moment, there are still many unanswered questions. How will regional governments respond? Will diplomatic efforts regain momentum? Can international institutions help reduce tensions? And most importantly, can policymakers prevent today's confrontation from becoming tomorrow's larger conflict? The answers remain uncertain, but history reminds us that moments of uncertainty often become turning points. Some lead toward escalation. Others eventually create opportunities for renewed dialogue and stability. Which path emerges will depend not only on military developments, but also on diplomacy, leadership, and the willingness of all sides to manage risks responsibly. That is why following the broader strategic picture is just as important as following the daily news cycle. Because understanding global events isn't about predicting the future with certainty. It's about recognizing the forces that shape it. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing to Jiang Decoded for more evidence-based discussions on geopolitics, economics, history, and the global events shaping our world. Thank you for watching. I'm Jiang, and I'll see you in the next video.